my name is Ryan New. I'm the instructional lead for social studies at Jefferson County Public Schools. We'll be joined today with Vincent Tinker, who is the K-12 literacy specialist for social studies at the district level. And we'll be talking about building disciplinary and critical literacy through K-12 social studies. We'll begin here with the standards, because really they're really pushing forth the understanding of why it is that we need to really talk about what disciplinary and critical literacy is and how it can really transform our classrooms. Not just in what the students will experience, but what the students will be able to take with them once they leave our rooms. As a quick reminder, these are the four major aspects of the standards. The first is really looking at the questioning, compelling and supporting questions that are involved in investigating. The investigation is really about the different disciplines that make up the standards. So in this investigation part, it's really about civics, economics, geography, and history. We use those as lenses in order to arrive at sources, to consider those sources, and ultimately use those sources as evidence in order to construct claims and arguments. And that once we've constructed those, once the students have constructed those, then they're able to communicate more effectively. So literacy is really about the reading, the writing, the speaking, and the listening that's going to happen inside of our classrooms. If we take a quick look at the standards, we can see that by looking at just the inquiry standards, the types of shifts that are going to be needed both on a curricular and instructional level. Here we see 5th grade. In 5th grade, we're looking at being able to ask these larger questions which really frame the investigation. When it comes to using evidence, the UE, we're really talking about using evidence to develop claims in response to those questions, about using primary and secondary sources, and being able to draw information from multiple sources in order to construct better explanations and points of view when it comes to creating those arguments. And then ultimately, once we're able to do that, we can share those in different ways and investigate how the problems of the past can also be explored today. You'll notice as well that in the very 4th communicating conclusion standard that we're going to be talking about using deliberative and democratic procedures to identify how the past is really being used to understand the present. If we turn to middle school, not only will the middle school standards encompass all the inquiry standards that exist beforehand as one gigantic K-12 vertical progression, but it also includes very important pieces for those 6 to 8 grade students who are going to be using these skills in order to investigate topics in your classroom. So here we see, just like we did for elementary school, that questions are going to help frame the understanding of what's going on in the classroom. That once again, students will construct claims and counterclaims using appropriate evidence from multiple sources and multiple points of view. That by doing so, they're also going to be, and here's where the disciplinary literacy piece comes in, as you'll see, using the origin, authority, structure, context, and corroborative value of the sources in order to help answer those questions. There's a certain set of skills that social studies teachers need to teach when it comes to pulling those skills from history and economics, geography, and civics. And that ultimately we want students to be able to take those investigations, to take those arguments and claims and pull them out into larger arguments, to explain what's going on in the world around them, and to engage in the society at large. While high school seems like it doesn't have as much, recognize that this is a collapsible system, meaning that whatever is going on in high school would include what's happening in middle and certainly what's going on in elementary. So if you're a high school teacher and you're looking and saying, this doesn't really give me enough of information of what I need to do with my students, then by all means, look backwards as the design was meant to show us how those progressions over K through 9th grade really operated so that you can have a better understanding of how to scaffold that understanding for your students. But here we'll see that once again, it's all about using questions as a way of framing our investigations through different disciplinary sources in order to use evidence to communicate conclusions. So if you look at a metaphor then, the students are trying to build a house, and traditionally we've always given them the bricks. The problem is that a house without mortar, i.e. what holds the bricks together, will ultimately fall. And so the inquiry becomes the mortar in which we're able to use the bricks, and students are able to use these bricks in order to construct much larger understandings of the social world around them. Why this matters is that not only is it going to help produce better citizens, right, but it's also aligning to the state assessment. As you can see here, and this goes for K through 12, where the assessment will be at the 5th grade, 8th grade, and 11th grade years. 5th grade will include all the standards K through 5, 8th will include all the standards 6 through 8, 11th grade will include all the standards 9 through 11. And that on that assessment blueprint for the social studies assessment, that 50% of what is going to be assessed will be the inquiry standards. And that essentially each of the other disciplines will have equal weight, which means then if you're a person who only teaches history or only views the standard through a history lens, then you're only preparing your students for 12.5% of the overall exam. This is a quick rundown, which will provide for you the link to when it comes to the state assessment. So what you can see here is a reiteration of what I've just explained, that all the standards are up for alignment, and that ultimately 5th, 8th, and 11th grades are the years to be tested. What I want to make note of is whenever we're looking at the depth of knowledge on the exam will have what are known as clustered sets, where students will be responding to stimuli. That stimuli, those cluster sets, are really about using evidence, right, to support claims and explanations, which means then students on 5th, 8th, and 11th grade will have 4 to 5 sources in which they must read, understand, and use those sources not only to help answer multiple choice questions, but also create written, or in this case typed, explanations and claims. Which means then that for the first time, our standards really embody what our discipline is about. It is about reading and writing, about argumentation and taking action. What I want to point out here is that oftentimes teachers say, but I've got to cover everything. I've got to be able to check all the boxes. That was true for the old standards, that it was very much a rote memorization, that you had to know this minutiae detail. But let's take a look at the second bullet under recall and reproduction. We see here that it is limited to a basic demonstration of social studies skills rather than a recall of social studies facts. What that means is that while teaching the sources, it is the language of the standard that matters most. So as you're deconstructing the standards and building towards disciplinary literacy, what you're going to want to do is make sure that you're using that academic vocabulary that you see in the standards in order to help the students figure out what it is that's going on in those different disciplines. For example, if you were to talk about interdependence and comparative advantage, then you would know that you're talking much more about an economic view of things. If you talk about change and continuity over time, that's much more of a historical understanding as well.
Hi, this is Vincent Tinker. I am the K-12 literacy coach for social studies. In this first film, we're going to be looking at disciplinary literacy, why it's so important for teachers to start considering using disciplinary literacy, and especially as you move up to the higher grade levels. This section will largely focus on why it would be very important for high school, but it does apply through K-12. It's not to take a focus away from content literacy, informational literacy, or critical literacy, all of which will be mentioned in this film. But this is the section in which we do discuss why disciplinary literacy will be very important for students' instruction. This is Milo of Croton, supposedly one of the strongest men in the ancient world ever to exist. And when asked how he became so strong, he declared that he began with the calf, and as the calf grew, he continued to carry it till the weight was something that he was used to. And that's an important thing to consider when we look at literacy. This is going to be a long process for many teachers to learn the different types of literacies, how to use them successfully. And every teacher is coming into this video series at different points. Some teachers feel like they've been carrying the bull, the full bull at this point for many years with their department or with their PLC, while other teachers might feel like this is all new to them. Many teachers, when it came to critical literacy or even disciplinary literacy on the survey, said this is new to them and they would like to learn more and not quite sure exactly what these various things are. Wherever you might be on this progress, that is fine. Every teacher needs to come into this wherever they might be. Sometimes you feel like you've been carrying the bull, but as you learn more and more about the topics and how to use literacy in your class, you might realize that you were actually maybe just carrying the calf. And as you learn more, you realize it's a bigger world of literacy out there. It's just important to remember that this is a process. There's going to be a lot of failures along the way and experimentation along the way. But it's not something that's going to happen at the end of one professional development, that this is going to be a series of things that people will learn and progress throughout time. So if this presentation is about disciplinary literacy, what are all the different types of literacy out there that we tend to focus on and we want to move schools in that direction? In your previous PD, you looked mainly at content literacy and disciplinary literacy. As you probably learned in the previous PD, the content literacy is a look at basic and intermediate literacy skills. The Shanahan research really talks about how this is something that elementary and middle school tends to focus on, and that many students become proficient at this by the 8th grade. It doesn't mean that this is something that obviously ends in high school. There's plenty of students that still need content literacy throughout all of high school because they come from different experiences and need to scaffold their learning. Disciplinary literacy is obviously what this presentation is about, and this is about moving our literacy practices away from general skills and techniques and more into what is unique to your own discipline, which as a high school teacher myself, I think this is where most teachers prefer to live, is they see themselves as content specialists. And I think teachers will be interested in moving more toward what is unique to their content. And as you see here in the definition, it's going to be more about reading and writing and the thinking of your own specific discipline. What we also see as unique literacies that come from that is looking at critical literacy, which is changing the relationship between the reader and the author and looking at the power dynamics between that. It's a focus on, as you see here, power and promoting reflection, transformation, action. It's to engage the student to be more critical of the readings that are out there. And then we have informational literacy, which we will not go into a lot today, but I want to make sure that people are aware of it. It is an emerging field looking at all the types of ways in which we get information. Typically, this can be looked at through media literacy, data literacy, and digital literacy. This can be as looking at Google and how algorithms work on Google to why you get certain things that pop up in your news feed or on Facebook, how we use internet searches in general or database searches. Where does information come from? And so what we would like to be moving to is obviously moving from content literacy more toward the disciplinary literacy side, but also keeping in mind some of these other literacies that we can talk about and go in more detail in another presentation. As you see here also, we have the 3 pillars of Jcps, which is the core of what Jcps is about. All of these literacies can help support the 3 pillars, which is very important. The backpack skills of success can be supported by disciplinary literacy. It's supposed to be authentic products and processes and thinking of your unique disciplines, and students are presenting how they have become learners in those disciplines. It obviously can live there. The racial equity policy and racial equity as a pillar can really be supported heavily by critical literacy and challenging some of those traditional narratives you see from authors and engaging the reader more with a critical lens into the literacies. And all of these will play into the culture and climate of Jcps and culture and climate of your classroom and your building as a whole, because we want students engaged in reading, writing, and thinking that is more unique to their discipline, and they can become critical readers and critical thinkers within their discipline, which will obviously have a huge effect on the climate and culture of your building and your individual classroom. Before we go into disciplinary literacy, let's take a quick look at critical literacy, What you see on the left here is our critical literacy framework, in which students and readers would be challenging the source. They would be looking at their identities and taking action. Let's start with challenging the source first. Remember that critical literacy is a lens, a frame, or perspective on how students would approach reading. And this is a critical lens in which they are looking at sources. Well, we have to keep in mind that sources are not neutral, and students should not read them literally. They shouldn't take them at face value. So what you see as an example on the right are just a few of many possible critical literacy questions that could be asked in class that could facilitate these conversations about sources and allow students to dig in deeper. As you see with the questions provided on the slide, you see that they really get to, at a base level, what the author is trying to get you to think, what the author has provided in a text, but quite often the author, with their perspective or possible bias, might have purposely or unconsciously left things out. Sometimes that we have marginalized groups that are not mentioned in a source based on the context of the time in which it was written, or a lack of consideration sometimes toward certain groups. Students need to think about these things. They need to be considerate of the approaches that sources have taken and the effect that they're having on them. Let's look at identity. Identity can be a variety of things. As a teacher, you have to understand that you have many different students that identify in many different ways. There is self-identity, there's social identity, and they bring these to how they read. And readers are not neutral. You could have 30 different students read the same thing and come up with 30 different ways in which they think that source was trying to shape them. You have to understand that identity plays a large role in who the student is before the source, what the source is doing to them while they read it, and how they're obviously going to be affected and even shift their own identity based on the source and its effect on them. Some sources will have no effect on them. It all just depends on what they're being approached with when in a class. And the last one here is action. This whole process is about transformation. It's about how they can become more critical in the things that they approach. Well, as you become more critical, you realize gaps that you might have in your knowledge that these sources allowed you to explore. So we are looking for action in which they could reconstruct text and try to make more equitable text. They could take informed action. They could do civic action. There's all different kinds of ways in which students can do something after they read a source to demonstrate how they've grown, how they've changed, and how they want to do something about that experience that they went through in class. It's about applying what they've actually learned and done with the sources in their own class. So the entire point of this video is why disciplinary literacy? To me, this is the most important slide that you'll see in the entire video series. And there's many different reasons why you might want to go down the path of disciplinary literacy. These are the three that I'm going to focus on here. And the first, and probably the most important to many teachers in the room, is that this is more authentic to your discipline. It is a greater focus on your discipline. It's not one more thing. This is actually the work of your discipline. Sometimes we've been asked to do, content literacy, where you have graphic organizers or writing styles or structures that don't feel natural to your class. This is an opportunity to say, this is what is unique to my discipline. This is authentic to my discipline. These are the types of reading my discipline does. These are the types of writing and communication that my discipline does. And these are the unique thinking skills that my discipline has. And I want to live within that discipline. I want to live within those readings. I want to live within that writing style. I want to live within those different skills that my students will be talking about those skills and using the academic language and vocabulary of that skill and of that discipline. This is not general. You don't have to stretch general writing and reading strategies into your class that don't seem authentic. This gives more autonomy to the discipline that you teach. So you can really own your discipline and own the things that obviously make that unique. And that being said, that means that disciplinary literacy will actually align to your standards even more, because your standards are discipline specific. So this provides you reading, writing, and thinking opportunities to live within your standards and hopefully teach your standards at a higher, deeper level than maybe before with content literacy. That these are obviously hopefully going to create more real world or authentic experiences for the student, because now they can start thinking like a chemist, thinking like a historian, thinking like a mathematician. They can start thinking like the professionals in your field, which is the goal of disciplinary literacy, as they think, talk, and act like professionals in your field, which as a high school person, I wanted my students to feel like a political scientist or to feel like a historian. And the more that they could live within that world, the better it was for my discipline and their abilities to do well in my class. But that being said, the second point here is that this works with all different types of literacy. It's not stop, drop, and do disciplinary literacy. It can be content literacy also. These literacies all work together that you saw in the previous slide. That content literacy is something that many students will still need. There's low and proficient readers that are in your class every single day, and they will still need content literacy. But these things are not mutually exclusive. Content literacy can work with disciplinary literacy, just like disciplinary literacy can work with critical literacy and informational literacy. All these different types of literacies can exist within a given class. And this is going to be the structure side of it, is providing a place for these literacies to live with each other. And through a couple examples, one in this video and one in another, I'm hoping to demonstrate how these literacies can work together. And the last point, which I think is very relevant for a lot of us as teachers, for our students, is this will help the students' long-term success. This will enhance deeper learning, which is a major push from the district, but probably many teachers within your building. Research shows that going into disciplinary literacy and other types of literacy can help improve your MAP scores, which will also help improve your ACT scores, hopefully. The more literacy that your students are engaging in within your class, they will read a little bit more. It's not about finding the right reading time. It's about finding the right readings that are unique to your discipline. They will continue to work with those literacies, whether it's reading, writing, or thinking. That will help build up stamina. Not many students sit there for an ACT and read nonstop and think nonstop for 35 minutes. So if they're engaging in these literacies in every single class, they are building up stamina for all this experience. And there's research that shows that this provides health maintenance for students, the higher their literacy rate is, and also going to be engaged more in civic activities and voting and being informed on public issues. There's a lot of benefits for students engaging in all these different types of literacy, specifically disciplinary literacy. So just to look at one area specifically for disciplinary literacy, let's take a quick look at deeper learning. Major initiative of Jcps of deeper learning is obviously the Jcps background, but if it's deeper learning, it's obviously going to be about the process of deeper learning. And so what are some of those attributes of deeper learning that we tend to see here? One is content mastery. How can you become a master in your content and thinking of the work of your content without disciplinary literacy? If we stay within the world of content literacy, that's general comprehension and general strategies that can be used in any class. It would be very difficult to reach content mastery without the skills, the thinking, and the reading of your own discipline. In deeper learning, you want students in that inquiry process to be problem solvers, to be critically thinking about problems that are unique to your discipline, that are authentic to your discipline. Again, critical literacy can be part of this, informational literacy can be part of this, but they're there to assist, obviously, disciplinary literacy that is the real thinking and problem solving of your discipline. Deeper learning asks students to be collaborative and to work together, to plan and share and think together. Obviously, we want our students to be experts in their field, in their discipline, and we want them to be collaborating like experts in the field. How do experts in your discipline talk to each other? How do they collaborate with each other? This is going to be supported, again, through disciplinary literacy. We want them to have the right mindset, the academic mindset, which means they're going to be thinking of your discipline-specific skills, their discipline principles, the practices of your discipline, This is all unique to your discipline, which once again is disciplinary literacy, not a general skill like content literacy. And then obviously we hit communication. We want them to write and think and speak like experts in that field, which can only happen if they are known to the area of their disciplinary literacy, if they are familiar and comfortable with those skills and thinking practices of their discipline. With JCPS, we tend to look at these backpack components as a deeper learning initiative throughout the entire district. What we would obviously like to move toward is making sure that these areas for deeper learning are relevant and obvious to disciplinary literacy. Imagine that students are presenting on the artwork that they may be created to show that they're emerging innovators or that they are effective communicators. And as they explain in their backpack presentations, they're using the language and talking about the thinking of that discipline. That they are maybe in science conducting experiments, and that's what they're demonstrating for their backpack project. Or in social studies, I would love to see an argument as a backpack presentation, because arguments and crafting those arguments is what historians and people in the field of social studies actually do. All those genuine, authentic practices for disciplinary literacy should live within the deeper learning. So as deeper learning, we tend to see it as a product for the backpack. It's also the thinking skills. And if content literacy is mainly comprehension, how can you ever do deeper learning as a process or as a product without going deep into your discipline? And that's why disciplinary literacy is going to be essential to do any type of deeper learning. Otherwise, it's just general content literacy, which isn't really going that deep. So in short, what's the bottom line of this presentation? It's you can't do deeper learning without disciplinary literacy, because you can't go deep without going into readings and thinking and writing that isn't unique to your discipline. And that disciplinary literacy is not one extra thing, which was a concern that I saw several times on the survey, is teachers are often given one more thing and one more thing. But this is actually the work. As I mentioned earlier, this is authentic to the discipline that you want to live in. And this is the work that most likely your teachers want to engage in, simply because it is unique to your discipline. It is the work itself. So enough talking about this at a 3,000-foot level. What could this actually look like in class? So here's an example of something pretty realistic to what students might actually come across in their real life. Obviously, we want our students to be able to look at anything that might come across the internet or in their life within their discipline, and be able to analyze it. So let's look at one skill that is unique to most disciplines, which is close reading, and do a close read of this ad, which hopefully you can already tell is probably coming from Facebook just by the design and coloring and structure of it. But since this is a video, if you would like to hit pause, feel free to do so right now and do a close read of that. Coming back, if you are interested in looking at how I would approach this close reading, there's all kinds of signals on this slide that would tip me off on how to do a close read. First, I would look at why this was suggested. This is informational literacy right here. Why was this page suggested to me? What did Facebook have on me when it comes to data and previous clicks on different ads and different people's likes and dislikes on Facebook to suggest such a page to me? I would be curious, obviously, about who these people are. Who is Secured Borders? What kind of organization is this? It is a sponsored link, so they obviously paid Facebook to be somewhere on my page, right? That's why this would pop up. These are, again, informational literacy and looking at sources and who is involved in this. Then I would also notice that this is labeled as a news and media website for whoever this organization is. And they have over 100,000 people that have liked this ad or this organization. So this maybe provides some level of credibility if it has such a level of support. These are just some of the things that would initially kind of stick out to me before I even look at the picture or the text that this text is looking at. Then I would look at what they had to say. Every man should stand for our borders. Join! Exclamation points. I love that. Why man? Why not person, people, women? What different kinds of groups are they possibly targeting? Does Facebook know that I am a man? And that's why this language is specific to that. So the language in the text itself maybe is unique to me in this sponsored ad here. Why choose this word? What does this word do? What tone does this word set? Why would the author of this ad say invaders? And so that's a clue of maybe what this ad is trying to do and who they're trying to target here. Other things I would notice in just doing a close read of this ad is look at this sign. I come across plenty of street signs in my life. Why is this one so filthy? Why does it look like it's lived on the ground for so long? This is also a street sign of some sort, so I would assume that there's a street nearby. But what do I also notice is that there's a fence. So this is about standing for our borders. Here's probably a fence, but yet you also see that there's business and industry on the other side. So is this a fence at a border, or is this some artificial fence that is some other location and they're just using it as a photo op? Why is there a road sign in front of a wall? Does that mean that there's a road going through the wall that they would be using as a checkpoint of some sort? So in many ways, is doing a close read of this, it really makes me wonder what else is going on here, why they're targeting me for this possible ad, and what they're really trying to say. These are the kinds of ads that students are going to come across in their life, and we want them to obviously have a critical eye in looking at all this. So what would this actually look like in class? This is obviously an example of close reading in a social studies class. You could layer in a thinking skill like inferencing into social studies. What you see here is the disciplinary literacy question for close reading, one of the questions that could go there. And this is all about making choices. There's multiple questions that you could ask that are disciplinary approach for social studies. You can obviously see the one that I've chosen that is highlighted there. What you also see at the very bottom of this is that it's also aligned to the state standards. So we have questions that align and achieve state standards also. This would be a great question for an initial breakdown of this Facebook ad. But how would you layer in the other literacies? How would critical literacy live here? Well, this, again, is all about creating structure and a place for literacy within your class. You could layer in any of these questions. The one I've chosen is obviously highlighted. Does the source give voice to historically silenced people or groups? Now, remember some of the key language that we've already pointed out in that ad. How would silenced groups look at words like invaders, or specifically an ad directed at men, but not all people? Who is their audience for this ad? The critical literacy question allows the students to go into a deeper, more nuanced level within the discipline. How would informational literacy? Well, I've already demonstrated much of that, but you can layer in a question here. Once again, it's about making choices. You can see the one that I've highlighted here. Who is this group? Are they typically seen as a conservative or progressive outlet, since they were labeled as a news and media? Now, what's also important here that you can see is that you can layer in map indicators. We've aligned all these things within one level to demonstrate how these things all work together at the map level. So this is a range typically that you see for high school students, and I've chosen or highlighted 3 here that you could have a focus on. So as you're doing the literacies, you can align to map. And so as more teachers move into disciplinary literacy, but all the literacies as a whole, you can align those skills or indicators from map to what you're doing in class. So this is all aligned, which will help bring up the map score. So it's not just ELA that can be responsible for map reading scores, but any teacher in the school that is engaged in literacy can be helping on the map scores, which will hopefully help on the ACT scores that we're working on also for your juniors. So what could this look like in an actual class or even an NTI environment? This is a slide you could just provide the student. These are the selected and highlighted questions that you saw in the previous slide. You could layer this in as a possible writing assignment for students. You could layer it in as a discussion. This can work in NTI. You could do this as a Google chat. Within Classroom, you could do this in a Google Meet. You can have these conversations. This can be something that they get routine into doing at the beginning of a class, or this is something a teacher can expand out and have a 20-minute conversation within their class just depending on how far they want to go into a given source. There's all kinds of conversation that can happen with just using sources and the right questions in your class. So as we wrap up, think about your mindset. Some of this might have been new to you. Some of you might have watched this video and said, I already have heard and know everything that's already in here. And that's fine. We're all in different places here. But as we move through the video series, I always like to lean on Maya Angelou, even though sometimes I roll at quotes being in PowerPoints. But when you know better, you do better. Some of this is new and you'll be kicking yourself for not knowing and not doing in the previous part. That's fine. We're all in different places. We can always move forward. Sometimes when you start to work on a new project or a new initiative, it will be messy. And I think of myself as Kevin Costner in Field of Dreams. You feel alone out in the field, toiling and toiling away. But the hope is that if you build it, they will come. And some of you have been living in this disciplinary world for a long time, but for some of you that is new. But it is going to be hard work moving forward and becoming a master within these different literacies. But students will rise to the occasion, is something I've always believed and what I've always experienced. In section 2, we're going to be looking at disciplinary skills and what they look like in a variety of subjects. And toward the end of this section, we'll look more specifically at social studies and what these skills look like within a given class. This will be a larger focus on comparing content literacy and disciplinary literacy to make those clear distinctions of the two different types of literacy and how they do differ and the different uses that they both have. So again, we're going to look at the definitions of content literacy and disciplinary literacy, and each of them having their unique focus within their column here. The first one I want to focus on is looking at the focus themselves of content literacy versus the focus of disciplinary literacy. As you can see, the focus of content literacy are general strategies, study skills like Freyer model, vocab, Cornell notes. Again, none of these things are wrong in any way. They all serve their purposes and do their things within a given class. But our move is to incorporate content literacy with the disciplinary literacy, which is obviously going to be a focus more on emphasizing your knowledge and your abilities to create, communicate, and use that knowledge within the discipline. And that's going to vary discipline to discipline. So one way you can look at that is looking at the focus, which is throughout all these different classes. This could be a schedule for a student in a given day, and look at how different class to class can look for a student in a given day, that each discipline has a unique focus, and that focus is going to shape the experiences that happen for a given student. Some might be developing skills of communication about culture and language, like you see in world language, versus discussing art, reading and analyzing and making art itself, or composing music and the thought of music and the performers of and composers of the music, versus social studies, which is all about making arguments and taking informed action, versus science, which is experimental. All these have different goals and focuses for an entire discipline. Only disciplinary literacy can get you there, even though content literacy should and can live within these also. So looking back at content literacy and disciplinary literacy, comparing the two, this time let's look at thinking and cognitive requirements. The thinking that a student is going to do in a disciplinary class is going to be unique to that discipline. It's going to be authentic to the field of study for that given class. While if you're looking at content literacy, again, it's general comprehension strategies like summarizing, paraphrasing, and questioning. And again, there's nothing wrong with doing any of those. They definitely have their place, and many students still need content literacy to help understand what's going on in that class. But again, we would like to move more toward disciplinary literacy to make more authentic, field-specific decisions within the class. That way, students start thinking like a historian or thinking like a scientist, and so on. So what do these skills look like in different classes? They are going to vary. So as a teacher, you're going to focus on the skills that apply most to your discipline. And this would serve as good ground of conversation within your PLCs and your departments about what are those various skills that are unique to your discipline. They might vary within a department depending on how different those different studies are, such as biology versus chemistry, or history versus political science, or algebra versus geometry. But discussing what those skills look like within your discipline, coming to some kind of common agreement on what those skills are and how you would scaffold those skills can really make a discipline-specific focus within your class. So if somebody was going to come into your class, they could easily hear the students and the teachers talking in a very discipline-specific manner based on the skills and conversations that they're having in those classes. That it should be not a surprise to anybody that would walk into your class that they are in a social studies class or a math class or science or art history or whatever it might be, because they are doing different things. They're working on different things. They're using different types of language within those skills. They are going to have very unique experiences, and they should all look different. Let's just look at one skill. Many disciplines look at making arguments. An argument can look different in different disciplines. So each discipline might care to different degrees on making arguments. They might vary on what an argument even is and define it in different ways that are unique to that discipline and the demands of the discipline and the state standards that would go with that. The evidence is going to look different, whether you're in an ELA class, a science class, social studies class, or music class, whatever the course may be. The evidence is going to vary based on the disciplinary readings, the writing, the thinking skills, the communication skills that you're using within that discipline, and the reasoning should vary obviously too. That should be based on the different thinking skills that are unique to your discipline. So all these things are going to look different. These are a whole different series of skills and thinking processes and cognitive requirements that we're asking our students to jump between class to class throughout a given day. Once again, they're going to have a very unique sound and look to what those classes actually are. To compare the two again, for content literacy and disciplinary literacy, I'm sure you can tell the trend at this point is that content literacy, when it comes to reading approaches, are general techniques. Sometimes that's put teachers off where they feel like it's not authentic to their class and they have to stop and do some kind of literacy that doesn't necessarily mesh with the type of literacy that is appropriate for their class. Again, that is the continual push to move toward disciplinary literacy, that you start practicing reading the way that experts in your discipline actually practice. Let's look at some of these general trends overall. Disciplinary reading approaches. I've tried to highlight some of the key aspects that you can look at for disciplinary reading. Obviously, it's going to be less generic. It's going to be more unique to how the experts in your field read those texts. Those texts should be less general, less textbook, more specific articles and research, or whatever your discipline might actually look at when it comes to text. You're going to start providing several sources instead of relying on just a single source, which quite often for content literacy has just been a textbook. That's just one authoritative source. In disciplinary literacy, you're going to look at various sources at various lengths, different complexities for your discipline. As a teacher, you might need to start doing read alouds because you need to model that language, because experts in your field use specific language in specific ways. And students don't naturally know how to do that. And that's something that the teacher will need to scaffold and demonstrate through modeling on how to approach the language and skill conversation when it comes to reading. You're going to have to start thinking about how to speak, write, and think overall. It won't always conform to what you've been using maybe for content literacy, which might have been more ELA focused. It would be fine in disciplinary literacy to move away from ELA techniques and move toward obviously techniques that are more authentic to your class, which is sometimes some of the issue that teachers have had in doing literacy in their class is didn't always feel authentic to the discipline. Disciplinary literacy is all about being authentic to your discipline, which means a lot of students will not necessarily know how to do some of this. So scaffolding will be essential in demonstrating how to do this reading and the approaches and thinking that goes with that, which means if you need to scaffold and do new skills and reading within your class, you need to start thinking about what does your class look like and how do you structure literacy within your class, which is obviously the point of the next video that we will be doing in this literacy series. So again, let's look at how these can look like in different disciplines here. We'll pick one reading strategy that applies to some disciplines that are out there. Let's just look at sourcing. Sourcing is a key aspect of social studies. It's usually the first thing that a social studies student would do when approaching any kind of primary or secondary source. But for other disciplines, that might not be a skill that they tend to focus on. I mean, look at math. Looking at the author for a math problem would be just a distraction for what they're trying to do. It's not unique. It's not relevant for what a student should be doing. While in art history versus music history and computer science, they're going to vary drastically from looking at scores and studying a score to visual analysis and visual literacies that would tie to that versus computer science, which is looking at program codes. This is all going to vary based on your discipline. And that's, once again, good conversations to have within your PLCs and your departments on what types of reading skills do students need to have within your discipline. So once again, when somebody comes into your room or a student is experiencing your class, it should look different. It should look different simply because it is a different discipline, and disciplinary literacy, again, is about going deeper into your discipline. So when they look at sourcing, even if they're using the same skill, the skill will vary discipline to discipline. And here's just a selection of what a student might experience if they were going to source in maybe their schedule for a given day. It will always look different because you're doing things that are unique to your discipline. So while the previous slide looked at a variety of disciplines, which is just a quick general look at some of those reading approaches, let's look at two disciplines in a little bit more detail, side by side. That way you can easily see how these reading approaches would vary discipline to discipline. In this case, let's look at math and social studies. While social studies might have a focus on primary and secondary sources, where they tend to compare and contrast those sources and events and authors and so on between them, math wouldn't necessarily be focused on that. They'd be focused more on word problems and solving that problem and looking at the mathematical symbols and the abstract ideas that they're trying to make meaning of, while social studies in return then would maybe focus more on background knowledge, but math would be focusing on maybe scaffolding that knowledge over time to build those skills, while social studies would do some of that scaffolding. Some of those readings and skills might stand a little bit more independent of each other. While social studies would also look at the meaning of words, because that would vary between which historical time period that they would be in, that they would take on different meaning based on the culture and history of that given civilization and those people. Math wouldn't be concerned with that. Language needs to be very precise in order to solve those problems, and they would have very specific meaning to those words already established, while social studies wouldn't. So again, this is just to demonstrate that the reading approaches and the types of text that different disciplines would tackle will vary drastically, and that's why it's important to focus and shift toward disciplinary literacy. That way you're doing readings and approaches that are more, again, unique to your field. So as we go slide to slide, you see we get more specific, going into more detail for each discipline. This one is obviously layering in a new level for social studies. These are the reading skills that social studies teachers and students tend to work on. And then these are the thinking skills that social studies students, meaning thinking like a historian or thinking like a political scientist, would tend to focus on. So with each discipline, they have their own unique reading skills that they would emphasize more than the others, and thinking skills that are unique to the discipline. So this, even though it's just an example of social studies, serves as a good point of conversation for your department and your PLC about what types of reading skills does your discipline focus on, how do you think about those reading skills, but also what thinking skills do you focus on, and how do you define those across PLCs and across your department, and also in our next steps, how do you start scaffolding some of these things also. And for our last point of comparison, looking at content literacy and disciplinary literacy, again, as you can probably tell at this point, the writing approaches for content literacy are general techniques that you could see across the board in any class would look the same, and most often they're about comprehension or simply the ability to remember and recite a text and the knowledge you got from the text, while the writing approaches for disciplinary literacy will vary based on the needs and demands of the disciplinary. In this example, let's look at some more specific writing approaches that apply to disciplinary literacy. Some of the key points that I have here are obviously trying to highlight some of the focus that you should have, which is copying notes does not really count as real writing for a discipline. That is content literacy writing, simply the ability to remember something and keeping track of whatever notes from a lecture or textbook you might have. that writing is helping part of the discourse of discussing the content, that writing is ingrained in your discipline. It's not an add-on, it's not something different, it's not an ELA moment of your class, that it is actually part of your class and part of your discipline and being authentic to your discipline. That technology in various ways in various disciplines can enhance writing, that your students should try to write to authentic audiences to mirror the actual experts in that field, that writing can be used to guide instruction, that teachers, we need to focus on providing constructive feedback, not just corrective comments or just a grade on writing, but actual feedback that can help the student grow as a writer in that field, that there's all different kinds of ways in which writing can be represented within your field. And last but least, too often when it comes to writing, teachers try to be English teachers. And unless you're an English teacher, you shouldn't try to be an English teacher. Do the writing that is authentic to your discipline. Often teachers talk that they weren't taught how to write in college and they don't know how to teach it to their students. That's something we can obviously help on. But if you realize that writing is authentic to your discipline and learn those skills of writing for your discipline, that will be a more natural process for you versus trying to be an English teacher in your other discipline. With one quick example, let's look at writing approaches between science and ELA. Looking at them side by side, you can easily tell the differences between the different disciplines when it comes to writing. While science is going to be looking at technical, precise vocabulary, and observations will be very short and to the point. With a passive voice, they often do focus on formulaic writing, so it doesn't distract from what the writing is itself supposed to do. ELA is more of a workshop approach with unique writing, quite often inserting the person into the writing themselves with all different types of writing genres. And they tend to avoid the formulaic writing, such as 3.5 essays. Again, reflect on your own discipline and what types of writing would be unique to that. And that will hopefully help with conversations about where your discipline and PLCs can think about for unique writing and disciplinary writing within your field. So after briefly reviewing all these various skills, whether it be thinking skills, reading skills, or writing skills in a given lesson, a given unit, or even a given year, you have to think about how are you going to scaffold these skills across a given point of time. This is an example of a scaffold that could exist within a given unit. If the end of your unit is to write a summative performance task, what compelling question will also be paired with that? And then understanding where your students are with this first supporting question and your first formative performance task, as you see there at the bottom. What kind of text and sources and other resources that your discipline might use to understand that compelling question, but also what kinds of discussions and thinking skills will you have to layer in throughout a given point of time so a student can understand those concepts that you hope they achieve at the end of a given unit. Scaffolding will be a major aspect of applying your disciplinary literacy skills. One way to look at scaffolding is through the gradual release model here. As you see on the left column, it can be about thinking skills, reading and writing skills, various literacies, and even discussion. As you see on the graphic, that any scaffolding begins with a focus on teacher instruction with heavily modeling, and then over time with the teacher and the student working together, they gradually release that responsibility and scaffold out those skills until a student can work on the skills or literacy more independently away from the teacher, which is ultimately our goal. Here's another way of looking at it with what the teacher responsibility is, with a focus of lesson and guiding instruction, but then more of it becomes collaborative and eventually independent. This will be some of the work of the exercise that you will do after this video.
When it comes to using disciplinary literacy, these are the four major pieces that we focus on. This would work for K all the way through 12, although admittedly, some of the questions may need to change, specifically for our younger students. Ultimately, and this comes from the Stanford Historical Education Group, we've decided on using these four historical reading skills as a foundation for developing disciplinary literacy in the social studies. Those are looking at sourcing, contextualization, corroboration, and close reading. And that ultimately, when we're trying to teach our students how to read, we in the social studies read differently. That's what makes it disciplinary literacy. So let's dive into each of these, and we've got a few examples. Ideally, it would have been better to experience these together, but because of the current situation, we can certainly follow up with some examples of what this might look like in your class. The first one we're going to look at is sourcing. Sourcing asks students to consider who wrote a document as well as the circumstances of its creation, i.e., its time, place, purpose, point of view, and so on. Sourcing is key to building claims and arguments as it helps with inferencing, interpretation, corroboration, and contextualizing. When it comes to sourcing, oftentimes historians, as they found out, will look at where the source comes from well before they ever actually start to read any of the source. The idea is that where a source comes from really matters. It provides a greater understanding of how the source was written, why it was written, the circumstances in which it was written, and really embodies these questions. So when we're looking at sourcing a document, we're having the students, even at a very young age, right, looking at who wrote this, what is the author's perspective, why was it written, when, where, and is it reliable? So that we can, from the very beginning, start to look at where a source comes from and its credibility. Now, obviously, you may not want to have all of these being asked of the document at one time, but you can certainly layer these in over your lessons and units. I, as a teacher, would oftentimes work from the very first, who wrote it and when it was written. Even just doing that allows it to cue to the students that this is an important piece of information for reading historical and contemporary documents. If we were to look at something, an image like this, and apply the questions to this, we start to look at, well, who took this photo? What is the perspective of this photo? Why was the photo taken? When was it taken? Where was it taken? And is the photo reliable or not? Now, if we were in a face-to-face environment, we would go through these together and we would discuss them, which is something that I constantly recommend for teachers to do, is that social studies should be social. We do not want to get away from students having to do this by themselves. It robs us of having a rich conversation. So imagine then giving your students something like this and having them try to source the document without any information behind it. It becomes very difficult for them to do, but with some kind of context, some kind of background knowledge, things are starting to make sense, right? Now, that's part of what social studies is living in the fuzzy realm, right? Where essentially we don't always know all the answers to some of the documents and sources that we look at. That's why interpretation and inferencing are so important. If we were to find out then that this is Princess Diana opening the AIDS or HIV ward in London in 1987, this might make some sense then about what's going on. So if we look at who did this, this is going to be something that was an image that was taken, right? For popular appeal, for understanding, right? Princess Diana is the focus of this. The perspective is really looking at her, right? Highlighting, and it's actually not highlighting the gentleman who is shaking her hand. Why? Because some of this is built upon the idea that during this time, it was not seen as something that you wanted to do. In fact, many of the folks actually hid during this time, and I'm going to start over because that is a wrong slide. I just can't get over it. So if we were to apply sourcing to this photo, we might say, well, who took this photo? What is the perspective of this photo? Why was this photo taken? When was it taken? Where was it taken? And is it a reliable photo or not? Now, we don't have the actual sourcing here, so we're going to have to do a lot of that inferencing before we know that. And part of this is actually having your students engage in the kind of conversations, right? Social studies should be social, and there should be a lot of discussions about trying to figure out what this is. Some students might have seen other images to know that, well, the haircut that Princess Diana has here, if they know that this is who she is, might be an 80s haircut. Usually the shoulder blades are a dead giveaway. Other people might notice here that one person is being sort of facing the camera, another one is not. That's part of the perspective that the photo is given. So why is that the case? We see here that there's something in the background, right? It looks like that we're in a hospital of some sort, right? Just based on that. So having your students to explore these initially allows for a lot of good conversation to take place. Once you find out more about this image, it then really brings it into focus about when it might be taken, and is it reliable, and why it was taken. Ultimately, the why it was taken is really what we're looking at. And so here's a situation where most people cue on what Diana is wearing, but few actually look at what she is not wearing, which is essentially a glove. And during the time when this was still known, unfortunately, as the gay plague, in a horrific understanding of it, there were still a lot of unknowns publicly about how AIDS and HIV is spread. And so the fact that she's shaking this man's hand, who's being, by the way, not featured in the photo, largely because this is still a time when a lot of gay men were not able to come out to their families. And in fact, many of the gay men in this ward clinic hid from camera, largely because they didn't want the media to make a spectacle out of them. Now, that's some background information I'm able to give to the students to give a greater sharpness of this, to give them greater context. So you can imagine then having some of your students engaging in sourcing documents this way. The next disciplinary piece is contextualization. Contextualization of a source considers the relevant components of history occurring at the time of the source's construction. And the one that we just saw, this would be what's going on when it comes to HIV and AIDS in England during the time that Princess Diana is part of the royal family. By placing a source in its relevant time and place and understanding how factors like setting, motivation, author's competence, preceding and following events, and objectivity influence the creation of the source, students can better understand and utilize a source for the creation of claims and arguments. So here are the major questions that we're looking at, which we are then going to apply to this image. So I'm going to go ahead and source this for you, but imagine sourcing this with your students about what's there, what's not there, why was this taken, when was it taken, what's the context of it, and so on. We're really looking at, okay, when and where was this document created? So we know that this is Mr. Rogers. We know that we have Officer Clemens here and Mr. Rogers. Basically, if we were sourcing this, what's going on in the document? They're sharing a swimming pool. They've got one towel. They're sharing water, right, as they do this. What is going on during this time? We have to remember that this is 5 years after the Civil Rights Act, 4 years after the Voting Rights Act. We have a situation where this is a year almost to the day of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And we also have a situation where what was going on publicly is that swimming pools, public swimming pools, were still largely segregated. Imagine having the students looking at this question and talking about what is the same then and what is different, right? Would we have the same connotations even about Officer Clemens, right, being an officer during this time? Or even a recreation that Officer Clemens and Mr. Rogers did 25 years after the event. What are the circumstances in which the document was created affects its content? This is a child show. This is trying to show something. So who is the audience that this was intended for, and how would they be understanding this in a larger world around them? So again, using documents in this way, using the questions for the disciplinary literacy allows us to read documents and provide skills to students in a way that no other content can. Perhaps one of the hardest ones is corroboration, which compares sources to identify agreements and disagreements. Giving multiple perspectives of an event allows students to discount contrary evidence and improve a source's validity and reliability by explaining discrepancies between accounts of an event. When multiple sources point to similar conclusions, interpretations are improved, allowing students to begin making correlation and causal claims. Corroboration improves the integrity of a source because it involves checking and cross-checking evidence, both of which help contextualize a source. So you can see that these disciplinary literacy skills overlap each other. When corroborating documents, students should compare a source to another, looking for agreements and disagreements. Consider other possible sources and evaluate the reliability of a source. As an example for elementary, but even with, this could actually go all the way through to high school, we're going to be using these questions in order to look at these two sources. So let's say that we're looking at, we've got a lot of Kentucky sources. Both of these are dealing with Kentucky. We could be having a lot of standards that deal with sort of the cultural environment of a region, or you might even look at the economic viability of a region. And so we're looking at comparing these two sources. So we're going to be using the questions. What do the documents say, right? Or what do other documents say? Do the documents agree or disagree? What are other possible documents that might support or refute what is being said in these documents? And what documents are the most reliable? So we have the first one here, the song lyrics from Loretta Lynn, Coal Miner's Daughter, where you can immediately see that there's some stuff that we could verify. Is there a Butcher Holler? Are there Van Leer coal mines? She talks a lot about what the day-to-day is. She uses I a lot, right? And the understanding that this would be something that was close to her and her upbringing, her understanding. If we take a look at source B, here we have a situation where just from the very get-go, they're using they. It makes it seem as though this is somehow disconnected. Where source A talks about how hard coal life is, but that it was necessary and they were able to get by, source B talks very differently about the coal life, even saying, going to the idea that, have you ever heard a mountain man cough his life away? So imagine then giving these two resources to students and having them be able to look at not only how these sources compare what coal life would be like in eastern Kentucky over in Appalachia, we're even looking at changing continuity over time. Source A is really dealing with 1970, source B is 1987. What has changed? What is going on? We could even verify, what do you mean by Route 23? Where would these jobs be? Where is Prestonburg in the idea of this, and why do they keep using this term holler, right? What does that really mean as far as reflecting the geographic and the geographic and cultural aspects of this region? So again, you can imagine having students being able to look and compare these using things like Venn diagrams or T-charts as a way of looking for these ideas. The final one of the four that we began looking at is close reading, which really calls on students to infer from a source's subtext. By annotating text, taking perspective, paying attention to detail, asking questions, and seeking clarification, students are more likely to engage with and think about a source. Close reading calls upon students to first source information, followed by recognizing claims as supporting pieces of evidence in the overall rhetoric, meaning what kind of language or semantics or syntax do they use? In the same way we just looked at those two sources, how do they use pronouns, I versus they? Give some understanding of the perspective and orientation from which they're arriving. All help students construct arguments from sources. So here's some of the major questions when it comes to close reading. What claims does the author make? What evidence does the author use? And again, what are the language, the symbols, the words, the phrases, and so on? Help persuade the document's audience. And how does the document's language indicate the author's perspective? So here we have a situation where we've got a source, it's unsourced, right? But basically we have this idea. So here we have a source that allows us to look at these questions. What claims does the author make? What evidence does the author use? What is the language, the words and phrases that are going to be used here, and the document's language that sort of shows perspective. Now, we have not sourced this. You don't know where this might come from, but automatically you might recognize this as part of a Facebook understanding. Next, we'll take a look at Ethan. Andrea? I'm trying to record something, okay? I know. Can you go to a different place in the house? Thank you. Here we see a different type of source in which we're going to use with close reading. Notice here that we don't have the sourcing of it, but automatically you might recognize this as a Facebook post. You'll recognize that it comes from some kind of heart of Texas, that it's sponsored, that it's happening on November 5th, which was from 2016. If you start to read it, it talks a lot about voting, right? It talks about fellow Texans. It's time to say a strong no to the establishment robbers, right? And that if you continue to read this, you'll see that the corrupt media does not talk about the crimes committed by Hillary Rotten Clinton. We're starting to look at the type of words that is being used here. What claims is this author making, right? How are they basing their understanding? We see it not only just in the language, but also in the imagery below. It talks a lot about getting ready to secede, right? Like Texas, I guess, if things don't go the right way, I guess they're going to secede from the Union, which sounds like that we have a lot of gay pride and ISIS, which has basically taken over, I guess, the rest of the United States here. What's interesting about this is that this is actually pretty an example of something that was pretty rampant during 2016 and the lead up to the election of Donald Trump. What we see, though, is that if we find out that this is actually one of the Facebook ads that Russia specifically used to target groups, then we can see that doing close reading allows us to examine why a source like this might be there. And it also provides an enormous amount of importance for being able to get students to see what's happening inside of a document. So these are just a few examples of being able to work through the sourcing, contextualization, corroboration, and close reading that allows for a lot of discussions in class as we use those disciplinary literacies to investigate sources to better help answer supporting and compelling questions.
This third and final section is looking at structures for literacy within your class. What that really means is, how do you intentionally plan literacy within your class throughout a given unit, throughout a course, and obviously in a given lesson, and the considerations that go within that. What you will see in this section will be models of what it looks like within social studies. So this video is going to focus on combining structure and skills. So how do you take all those different assorted things that you just saw on the previous slide and bring them into some kind of coherence for your discipline? This will look different in every single discipline, and that's a structure that you as a discipline expert can help focus on and help create and craft what that structure will look like. What we can do here is demonstrate what this would look like for social studies. Keep in mind that the disciplinary focus of social studies is argumentation and then taking informed action, which obviously influences the structure that we're going to create. We're going to do this by two different ways, looking at a structure and then the relationship of that structure to those skills. The overall structure here is looking at how to communicate and think to learn, while also communicating and thinking to demonstrate that learning. So the structure that social studies deals with in trying to make those arguments would be looking at sources, organizational tasks, which many would consider like graphic organizers to help them organize the information that they're learning in a given class, and then discussion tasks. And then to demonstrate that learning, you would have formative performance tasks that would help answer the supporting question of that day, and they would be help building to the summative performance task to answer the compelling question, which is the question for the entire unit. Then we would layer in the disciplinary skills. These would be reading skills to help understand and break down those texts, and the writing, speaking, and thinking skills that are also used to demonstrate that learning. Notice we've organized our reading skills. So as a social studies team, we would have to identify what skills we would focus on as a discipline. Below that runs the course of all the structure would be the discussion. Notice that we have consensus building, conversation, discussion, deliberation, dialogue, and debate. Those would be social studies types of discussions we would use. And then below, we have also identified all the various thinking skills that we would use for this discipline. Now, keep in mind, this will vary discipline to discipline, And this is the overall kind of structure that you need to think about in your PLC or as a department of what are the components of the literacies for your discipline. You can even see in the communicating conclusion section, we've even scaffolded those tasks. If you look at the performance task scaffold, students would begin with trying to write descriptions, move to generalizations, then explanations, claims, and then once they've mastered some of those skills, then they would be in a position to write, hopefully, quality arguments. And even the rubric criteria are here, demonstrating that you would begin with trying to be accurate, then clear, then using evidence, and showing reasoning with the possibility of adding in disciplinary specific criteria to the rubric. If we want to look at the taking informed action side, you see that present also, which would be aligned to the backpack process, which for social studies would be understand, assess, and act as a process. So here in this one structure, you can see how all these things live together. The various components of a class like sources, organizational task, formative task, and questions also reside within the sections that you see in the left and the right column of reading skills, but also communicating skills with discussion and thinking underlining all those aspects throughout a given class or lesson. So after thinking about the structure for your discipline, now you are able to see all the different components, the different thinking skills, the discussion, the sources or text that you would be using, and what the relationship would be to the questions that you ask in class, and also the formative task to the summative performance task. Once you see this, you would have an idea of where you want to go with your class. And if your goal of a lesson, of a unit is to make an argument, are they making arguments in their formative performance task on day one? Are you scaffolding that out with just descriptions, building up to generalizations, and then explanations and claims, finally up to the argument? What skills are you scaffolding throughout a given unit to help your students out to understand how to apply these literacies and thinking skills to work all together with the text and sources that you choose for your discipline? In having a structure, it allows you to also consider the different components that would exist within a given lesson. What would that communicating and thinking learn look like in your discipline? Well, typically, in our example, we would have text, organizational task, and discussion task. Within your PLC, we would like you to obviously start discussing what are the texts that you use in class. For your discipline, it could vary. You could have all different types of variety depending on what applies to your discipline, but choosing the right disciplinary readings and text would really be beneficial for obviously making it a more authentic experience to perform that discipline like the experts in your field do. Most experts probably aren't doing textbooks as their main reading. That would be content literacy typically, not that it doesn't have a place, but it doesn't always mesh well with the disciplinary literacies. So you have to consider the different types of text that you would be using. It might be works of fiction, math and science might lean a little more toward data and real world scenarios. All disciplines might consider different types of articles, which could vary across the board and what that might be. Social studies obviously leans typically toward primary and secondary sources, but hopefully this creates a conversation within your PLCs about the types of text you choose to use that you want to investigate and use those literacies on. Organizational tasks, or some call it graphic organizers, are how students are capturing this information that they're learning in the class. That information might be coming from text, it might be coming from discussions, it might be coming from lectures that are happening in class. But how are they organizing and sorting this information that they can then use later on a formative performance task for that lesson? There's all different kinds of ways in which you can lay out information and graphic organizers for students. We have several of these organizations here, like sorting tasks, comparing tasks, conceptual tasks, text analysis, and writing supports that might help aid a student to get to that formative performance task. But organizational tasks help students organize their thoughts, and this might lean toward different disciplines and which types of tasks you would want to choose. As we mentioned earlier in science, they might choose shorthand, bullet form, while social studies might do more compare and contrast, Venn diagrams, T-charts, webbings, timelines. It all depends on what is unique to your discipline. So again, as we look at all these different areas, they are discipline unique, and that hopefully fosters conversation within your PLC of how would you like your students to organize their information during class so they can then use it for the formative performance task at the end of the class. And the last one is discussion task. All classes should have some type of discussion. Obviously, the discussions can vary from discipline to discipline to reflect the thinking skills or the reading skills of a given day. So just like text represent the reading skills, organizational tasks can help facilitate the reading skills and the thinking skills. Discussion tasks can be part of those thinking skills also. Sometimes you might want to consider your discussion task in the frame of how long that would take and how fast you want to move in and out of discussions. So we have some examples here on the right. We've also designed discussion cycles. So here's one example. You see discussion cycle 1. You see what the entire class would look like in discussion cycle 1. This is what a lesson would look like. So you begin the day with contextualizing the supporting question, which would be the first few minutes of class. And then you see that the students are engaging in individual, then group, then class as they work on their organizational task, have discussion while they're in a group and class structure, and the sources live throughout. So you can see for discussion cycle 1, there's 4 different rounds within a class of individual, group, and then class, in which they could be looking at various sources and doing different tasks. And then at the end, that's bookended with the formative performance task. These discussion cycles will vary class to class, discipline to discipline, where a lab or an experiment might fit in, or composing music, or having time to design or work on a CAD project. These discussion cycles outline and demonstrate in a visual way of what is happening in your class and when that is happening. So it's very clear to the teacher and very clear to the students when those discussions, when those sources, when those organizational tasks are operating with either an individual, a group, or a class structure in your given lesson. So what you see here is a demo of what a class structure could look like. It is marrying all the different components that you have on your conceptual structure of your discipline that you saw at the beginning of this video, laid out in a way in which could exist within a class. As you begin class, you would engage in the supporting question. What is the question that ignites the investigation for the day for the students? As you see below, we have several different examples. These are just a few of the ones that you could do. You could question the question, have students challenge the question that you are working on for that day, and be able to think deeply about what the question might mean and what results might look for that question. You could spark curiosity with a source. That could be the example that I showed with the Facebook lesson that we had. You can contextualize within the compelling question and give background to what that question could be like and make a deeper understanding of where that question is coming from. Or you could give a mini lecture. This is supposed to be 5 to 8 minutes to engage the question, to spark that curiosity within a student so they are engaged and prepared in the investigation of what your lesson is that day. The middle structure here is how to engage in the lesson throughout discussion. Again, you see our discussion cycle. As I mentioned earlier, we have several different others. This is where your organizational task, discussion task, and sources can all live. As you see, they live within the discussion cycle. And you need to think about what kind of disciplinary skills do you want to reside within your organizational task, within your discussion task, what discussion task would help facilitate that cycle and that supporting question for the day in the best way. And then obviously be really considerate of the sources that you're using. This is where all those pieces kind of live within the class as they engage in that discussion and those discussion cycles throughout that day. And the final component here is communicating conclusions, which would be the last 5 to 8 minutes of class, where they could do written examples. Again, these are the social studies examples that are scaffolded out for written. Or if you're short on time, you could always and easily do verbal tasks. Here's a couple examples of consensus building or 4 corners or turn and talk if time is very limited, in which you could demonstrate communicating conclusions in a variety of ways. But this is a lesson structure in which you can see how all these components live together. This is a social studies example, a one-pager of an inquiry implementation guide for what this would look like in social studies. As you see, it's the same thing that you saw before, except it's a little more spelled out on what those tasks might be in the engaging the supporting question section. The discussion section has a few more cycles. We have more than this also, but these are the most common that you'd probably see within a social studies class. And then brief explanations of communicating conclusions. Again, this is allowing you to create a structure in which the different literacies, specifically disciplinary literacy, and those thinking skills, reading skills, discussion skills, all these skills can be merged together to list out and coexist together within a given class. In conclusion, thank you for taking the time to watch this film on disciplinary literacy, structure, and skills. If you ever have any questions, feel free to reach out via email and contact any of us. This is a field in which we are going to be taking a large focus on this year when it comes to disciplinary literacy, informational literacy, and critical literacy. So we will be coming out with many new instructional tools throughout the year. Feel free to reach out and contact us at any time. Thank you again for your time.